Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our Iowa History Book Club tonight. We are so glad that you're here. We know a few folks might be kind of coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started right here on time. My name is Andrew Klumpp, and I'm the editor of the Annals of Iowa here at the State Historical Society of Iowa, and we're just so glad you're here tonight. Every quarter, we host, the State Historical Society hosts a book club during which we hear from authors that discuss all periods and areas of Iowa history. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website, iowaculture.gov. If you do want to come to book club again, you'll have to register just like this time, but you'll find it in the same spot. And today we're continuing our 2022 Iowa History Book Club series, and we're going to be continuing with the book Mormons at the Missouri, 1846 to 1852 by Richard Bennett. And we're delighted to have Dr. Bennett with us here tonight as well. Before we go ahead and get started, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker and we jump into the topic. One is that closed captioning is available. You can activate that through the action bar on the bottom of your screen. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a show subtitle or closed captioning that you're able to select. So if you need that option or would like it, it's there. We can also look forward to a great Q&A session with Dr. Bennett at the end of the conversation. We're going to reserve at least half of our time for conversation. And so what you can do throughout the evening is go ahead and drop your questions at any point in the evening into the Q&A feature. It just looks like two little dialog boxes. It says Q&A. My colleague Jennifer Cooley and I will be able to receive those, and we'll be able to pose those questions to our speaker. We may not get to all of them, but we're going to do our very best to get to them all. So if you have questions, if you've got one right now, you can put it in. But as we talk feel free to put any questions you have in there. We'll see them, and we have got lots of time to talk about them. If you ever want to share any stories or reflections, I know many who are going to be here tonight have connections to the trail or to the winter quarters. You can drop those into the chat as well. So questions in the questions, but if you have stories or reflections, feel free to share those with the other participants as well, and you can do that in the chat function. So that's kind of how we'll organize our time and our comments tonight. And then finally, we just want to remind you that participating in book club, you agree to engage respectfully with the presenter and the host and other participants. That includes in the chat. So any type of disruptive behavior is prohibited. And if we violate that, we may delete comments or remove participants who aren't complying with that kind of desire to be respectful of others in our virtual environment. With all of that said, I am really delighted to introduce our guest tonight, Richard Bennett. Richard Bennett, along with his wife, currently leads the Mormon Trail Center at Winter Quarters, which is fittingly the topic of this evening's conversation and our book. As you know from your reading, if you've done it, for tonight, the Winter Quarters is located just across the Missouri River from Iowa in Nebraska. But the story really includes so much on both sides of the Missouri. And for us here in Iowa, it really involves that trek across Iowa as well. So we're looking forward to that. Prior to his service at the Mormon Trail Center, Dr. Bennett taught for many years at Brigham Young University as a professor of church history and doctrine, and served as the head of the Archives and Special Collections Division at the University of Manitoba before joining the faculty at BYU. There's much more we could share about his career, but I know that we're all here to discuss the book. So without further ado, I just want to welcome you, Dr. Bennett. We're so glad you're here, and thanks for making the time.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's a joy to be with you and with your audience. And I look forward to discussing a most important chapter in Iowa and American and Mormon history.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I have to be honest and say that it was your invitation probably a year ago to come to the symposium that you had at the Winter Quarters or right across the river that kind of has stuck with me so long that that got me thinking about this and wanted to have this book club discussion with you, how important to Mormon history, but also Iowa history, the Winter Quarters and the Missouri really are. So yes. You are kind of responsible even for this invitation too, because you got me thinking all that time ago.
Well, the whole story of the Mormon Trail across Iowa particularly is an unsung chapter in Mormon and American history. Everyone thinks in terms of the trails, really starting from the Missouri and then going west, whether that's the California Trail or the Oregon Trail or even the Mormon Trail from Council Bluffs or Winter Quarters, which was on the Nebraska side, all the way to Salt Lake or California. Lost in the whole story is the Great Iowa Crossing. And this last week, we went back to Keokuk, Iowa on Sunday. And then on Monday, we went across the entire Iowa Mormon Trail from Keokuk all the way following Highway 2, mainly, across southern Iowa, followed the Mormon Trail all the way to the Missouri River to Council Bluffs. Unsung story.
It really is, and all unsung story, and also the trials of it. I was rereading the book again recently and hearing about the mud and how difficult it was to cross Iowa, from Illinois to get to even get to Council Bluffs. But reading about those kind of initial visions of we'll get here by April and then we'll move on, but realizing how difficult that Iowa crossing was, it really kind of was impactful this time reading through. It was tough terrain and a real challenge.
Well, the original plan, as I bring out in the book, was for the Mormons to leave their home in Nauvoo, Illinois. They had to be out of there because of intense persecution, which the saints were really suffering from. They had no choice but to leave and to get across Iowa. They thought they were looking at going to the Rocky Mountains. And the original plan said, well, we should, if we leave in the wintertime, and they began to leave on the 4th of February, if you can believe that, crossing the Mississippi River on ice at that time. They thought that they could get across Iowa in 6 weeks. The ground stayed frozen and, it'll be bumpy and tough, but they should be able to get all the way across to Council Bluffs no later than the 15th of April, because they knew, as the Donner Party would find out to their horror, they knew that you had to be away from the Missouri River, if you're going to the Rockies, that is, no later than the 1st of June. If you're later than the 1st of June going from the Missouri River to the Rockies, you're tempting fate, in the sense that you could get trapped in the snowstorms of the Rocky Mountains, even in the plains. And so their thought pattern was, we'll get across Iowa in maybe 6 weeks. We'll leave most of the folks back at Grand Island. That was the original plan. And a vanguard company of Brigham Young and other leaders of the church would go out and find wherever it was they were going. And it should have all happened in 1846, the year of decision, as Bernard DeVota's great book talks of. But that's not what happened, thanks to Iowa. Iowa has a mind of its own.
It does. This spring has reminded me of that. We had some warm, muddy days, and then we had snow a week ago. It's been all over the place. With mud.
It was 88 degrees here in Omaha 2 days ago in the afternoon. It was 48 by 2 o'clock in the morning. I mean,
here in Des Moines, it was 80 degrees in Des Moines the other day, and this morning when I took my dog out, the wind chill was 19, and so it was just But
1846 was the wettest spring, from my research, in the 19th century in Iowa, at least from the time they started keeping records. Because it rained incessantly from the time they left Montrose, which is across the river from Nauvoo, Illinois, and heading up through the Des Moines River Valley, and then going west. It never stopped raining. And so instead of getting across in 6 weeks, it was 4 months. And by the time they reached the Missouri River Valley, Council Bluffs region, it was too late to go to the Rocky Mountains. And so Iowa is a conundrum for the saints. It's just, what are we going to do now? It's going to lead to all kinds of experimentation and reassessment and reevaluation. And it was a very tough moment for the Latter-day Saints. We're talking 12,000 Latter-day Saints, Mormons. Latter-day Saints is the name more preferred today. To leave Nauvoo and cross Iowa, they're coming in installments. They had the Vanguard Company first with Brigham Young and the leadership of the church. Then you got the spring group coming. Then you got the summer group coming. Then you got the September group coming last. it's going to be one difficult logistical nightmare getting across Iowa.
Yeah, I was so impressed, even reading the book again, and what I know of this history, right, is how organized everything was, but at the same time, how nimble things had to be sometimes, changing plans with 12,000 people is such a massive undertaking. Everything was organized, but at the same time, there was this constant kind of need to reevaluate and figure out how are we going to survive and then still get to where we're going. It was a particularly impressive feat, but also incredibly challenging one, you could tell.
Yes, now, the Mormon Trail, or the Mormon Exodus, differs fundamentally from the California and Oregon trails in many different ways. One, Andrew, you just put your hand on it, the highly organized nature of the Mormon Exodus, with captains of hundreds and 50s and 25s and 10s and all of this sort of thing. Number two, it's not a male-dominated go get the gold in California kind of a thing. It's not a gold rush. It's a family movement.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything in American history up to that time, at least, that compares to it, where you're going to have moms and dads and all the children, of which you've got thousands, on their way west, and they don't even know where they're going.
Mm-hmm.
Get that?
Yeah.
They haven't identified where it is they're going to go, for sure. Maybe the Salt Lake Basin, but they may have to check out and see how that's going to work. It's a family-driven, deeply religiously motivated exodus.
Mm-hmm.
I think the term exodus is the right word. It's not a trail. It's an exodus from the United States out into the wilderness to find a new place where they could worship according to the freedom of their own dictates of their own conscience. And it's not economically motivated.
Mm-hmm.
So you get so many. It's fundamentally different
mm-hmm.
in its nature than most of the other trails in America.
Mm-hmm. And it was, you mentioned, kind of this leaving the United States, which got me thinking too about this this kind of dynamic of trying to avoid some of the persecution and challenges, especially with the governments of Missouri and Illinois, and it just got me thinking a lot about those kind of external pressures that were pushing the saints farther out into the wilderness, as you said. And it just was, I thought that was a really interesting kind of element as well, because several of the folks did decently well eventually in the eastern side, and the Council Bluffs area had good places to farm, but they still journeyed westward because of those, from my sense, some of those desire to gather, but also the sense of having had negative and very, very negative experiences with state governments in Illinois and especially Missouri.
Oh yeah, they were. Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a very new religion.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't based on a Trinitarian doctrine. It had other books of scripture, Book of Mormon and other things like that. And it was very much opposed to slavery, which is one of the reasons the Latter-day Saints were expelled out of Missouri at the price of many dying. I mean, there were so many combustibles
mm-hmm.
that it was new and strange. And then you had rumors of plural marriage and other things at that particular time. And you add it all up, and the persecution became so intense and unjustified. But the fact is, that's the reality. There was going to be a war in Nauvoo. Better get out or we'll kill you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Joseph Smith was, of course, killed in Carthage, Illinois in 1944. The writing was on the wall. And so, frankly, Missouri is going to be their salvation. Not Missouri, Iowa is going to be their salvation, even though it's going to be tough to cross. At least it's better than dying in the streets of Nauvoo.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's such an interesting moment too, right? Because it's 1846 that they're escaping across Iowa, but that's also the year that Iowa is coming into the Union. So there's this kind of, Iowa is not quite yet a state, will be at the end of the year, but Iowa's a little bit less defined, and so there's that flexibility to come through as Iowa kind of finds itself as a state government. It's an interesting kind of confluence.
I was just doing some research today, Andrew, that Brigham Young wrote letters to the territorial governor of Iowa. I forget his name, it'll come to me, in 1846, asking permission for them to cross Iowa.
Yeah.
asking for advice, and giving direction as to where we think we're going to go. He wanted to foster good relationships with the civil authorities, because we learned from our experience in Missouri, work together will bring greater cooperation and support. And Iowa was very, very supportive. They went up the Des Moines River, up through Bentonsport, Keosauqua, Bonaparte, if you know that part of Iowa. They went up that way before they headed west across barely marked Indian trails all the way west through what is today Cordon, Creston, and eventually to Council Bluffs. First part of that journey was horrendously difficult, as we said, because of the rain. The last half got a little better.
Yeah. I just it's very interesting, this kind of moment in time that this is all taking place, that it's very dynamic.
Oh yes, and it's in Iowa that the United States Army came. The Latter-day Saints first thought that they were going to be interfered and impeded by the United States Army, but at Mount Pisgah, which is west of Creston, just east of Creston, frankly, it's Mount Pisgah that the United States Army begs the Saints for 500 men to march off to San Diego in the war with Mexico, the newly declared war with Mexico over California. That's an Iowa legacy. There wasn't even an Iowa militia as far as I know, in that war, but the Mormon Battalion goes off along with other battalions, but we were much closer than, say, New York or Pennsylvania. And that's a story in and of itself. That is really an Iowa story.
It's incredible too to think, that this kind of war with Mexico is also happening at the same time, as all of these other events. And to your point about wanting to work with civil authorities and contribute, that the Mormon Battalion story really is, it seems to show a very agreeable posture, if nothing else, to wanting to contribute and to be a part, and
well, at first though, the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, were flatly against it. Where were you when we were driven out of our homes in Nauvoo? Where were you when we were driven out of Missouri? Martin Van Buren said to Joseph Smith once, "Your cause is just, but there's nothing we can do for you," during that height of persecution in Missouri. Now you want 500 of our men when we need them most desperately out here in the wilderness? So it took some cajoling, thanks to Thomas L. Kane, who wasn't a Mormon himself. He was from Pennsylvania and a close friend of President Polk. They finally agreed, yes, if the money is right, it'll help us. We need provisions, we need supplies. And they paid handsomely for that battalion, and it turned out to be a godsend for the United States and a great blessing for the Latter-day Saints in Iowa.
Yeah, well, because that was interesting too, to kind of see the battalion being able to answer this kind of moment of where are we going to get the funds to make this trek across, right? If I'm remembering right, the Saints end up, in the Council Bluffs area, and they're cash strapped and trying to figure out what to do. And the battalion contributes a lot to this ability to envision the path forward, or to at least give a clear idea of what that path forward will be.
Well, as you may know, Andrew, when they got to Council Bluffs, and I'm talking about the region of Council Bluffs on both sides of the river, because there was no city. I mean, there's nothing. There's no Safeway, there's no hospitals, there's nothing. We're going to have to winter here. We have to put in our winter quarters on both sides of the river, both in what is today Council Bluffs, Iowa, and Omaha wasn't even thought of at that time. It's going to be over there in winter quarters, which is now part of Omaha. But I mean, we got to survive. It's a matter of survival. We got 12,000 people here, and it's going to be this moment is critical. And so the Iowa Mormon Battalion invitation saves the church financially and becomes a great blessing to the United States in their quest for California. That's the longest military march, arguably, in American military history. 2,000 miles from Council Bluffs down through Fort Leavenworth, down all the way through now is New Mexico and Arizona to San Diego, and then back up to Salt Lake. By that time, Brigham Young will have discovered the Valley of the Great Salt Lake, and those Mormon Battalion men will march back to Salt Lake and meet their families. So there's nothing quite like that in American history.
Well, and I really appreciate your kind of even framing it as an Iowa story, right? Because it really is one, and it's one that we don't hear about much in Iowa history, because it so happens that these were people who were transient or migrating through the state, but they were mustered and left from Iowa. They weren't necessarily Iowans, but they were people who were living in Iowa at the time, and I think that's very much a part of Iowa history that we don't hear enough about. These people who were from Iowa, at least temporarily, making this really big contribution.
And then there's another side of the story, that here comes the Mormons and all their wagons, and we had 1,800 wagons, by the way, 1,800 wagons with 5 to 6 to 7 people per wagon, many of them walking, by the way, and we're running out of provisions, and so it's going to be the Iowans in eastern part of the state along the Des Moines River Valley who are going to save the Mormons, because the Mormons would put on concerts. They love to play music, even though they're on the wagons going west. They put on concerts in places like Keosauqua and Bentonsport, and the Iowans came out, paid for it, and really helped the saints with provisions. It's really a story of Iowa generosity and kindness in our deepest time of need. And I think we all, I'm speaking as the Latter-day Saint or Mormons, we owe great debt to Iowa to have helped those saints during that very difficult time.
Yeah, it's incredible to kind of hear those stories too, right? Because so often we hear stories of the Latter-day Saints in Utah or Nauvoo, but the Iowa element, and you mentioned this in your book, and we've talked about it a little bit here too, but Iowa element in the winter quarters are much less prominent. But as you're framing, this is a critical moment, if not necessarily a starting point or an ending point, but one that's absolutely critical and deeply important.
And then it goes on from there. Not all Mormons went west. Some stayed back at Council Bluffs and established the city of Council Bluffs, which they first named Canesville, by the way. And they settled up and down the Missouri River Valley in lots of those little towns in western Iowa that today are like Creston, Iowa, not Creston, Crescent, Iowa, and Council Bluffs itself. And some of those families, Andrew, for instance, the Hyde family, some of them stayed back and they got interested in the grocery business. And later on, they started a little grocery store called Hy-Vee, which today, I think everybody in Iowa knows about that. And that's an old Mormon legacy, because they stayed back and didn't follow Brigham Young. They drifted into what's called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Community of Christ, our cousins throughout all over Iowa. And so there's a great lasting legacy that goes to this day. Some Mormons who didn't go west and made a contribution, a tremendous contribution to Iowa history, especially western Iowa, southwestern Iowa. Potawatomi County, Harrison County, and up and down the Missouri River Valley, a wonderful heritage. Yes, most Mormons did go west, but not all of them. And they stayed and made a tremendous contribution to Iowa history.
I thought that was, I remember one of the presenters at the symposium that I was at the center last year, being about those who stayed behind. And I just found that to be a fascinating element of Iowa history as well. And the broader history, including Nebraska, but the region's history that often is underexplored by those who are less familiar with Latter-day Saints story, but deeply important, these folks who are founding these communities and eventually building businesses. And just found that to be a really rich part of this story as well.
I think you can add to that, Andrew, that the development of the city of Council Bluffs, first called Canesville by the Latter-day Saints, came to about 5,000 people by 1852. mainly a Mormon town. It was not mainly, it was a Mormon town for the first 5 years. And because of the economic juggernaut that they developed, especially after the 49ers came through, on the way west, southwestern Iowa attracts the railroad. And the railroad's going to come to Council Bluffs in large measure because of the economic imprint of the Latter-day Saints. And I don't think there's any question that that has an enormous impact on Iowa history and on the development of the West.
Oh, absolutely. You're just listening to you talk got me thinking too, about this kind of large number, not all the Latter-day Saints, but a large number who stayed behind, several thousand. And I'm just curious if you have any insights about why the reception to the Saints was different in southwestern Iowa and Nebraska than it was in Illinois, in Nauvoo, right? I think about this on opposite sides of Iowa. There's very different experiences happening with the church, right?
Well, the main reason I think is that western Iowa in 1846 was almost totally uninhabited. The Mormons were the first one on the block down there, whereas that wasn't the case in Missouri.
Yeah,
and it certainly wasn't the case in Illinois. There was established resistance and deep pockets of persecution long before the Mormons got there. Whereas in Iowa, it had been, first of all, in eastern Iowa, the Mormons are just passing through.
Yeah,
And they're welcomed so long as they're passing through. And when we get to Council Bluffs, there isn't anyone virtually. There was Sarpy's Ferry, and a few other establishments, but that's primarily the reason why western Iowa welcomes us, because we're the first ones there.
Yeah.
And we stay there until 1852, when Brigham Young finally insists that most of the Saints come on west. It's time to come west. Don't stay there. It has served its purpose. It's been a blessing to us. We now need to move to the Salt Lake Valley. But not until there had been a great measure of great work done in southwestern Iowa.
Yeah, it's just interesting. It's so to think about this kind of different experience and the importance of the space and being on the frontier. I realize I'm looking at the time and it's flying by, and I'm really enjoying this conversation, but I want to leave time for, I've got some questions to offer from the chat. If you have questions, now's a great time to drop those in. But I want to ask one more question before I move to the Q&A from the audience. And that is just, in the beginning of your book, you talk about how the winter quarters hasn't gotten as much attention from historians, especially Latter-day Saints historians. And I wonder if that's still the case, and if you have any thoughts on why. I think, in the Annals here, we've reviewed 2 books in the last few years that have a connection to Nauvoo. One is a book called The Kingdom of Nauvoo by Benjamin Park, and another that's going to be in this next issue is about Joseph Smith's Run for President by Spencer McBride. So I can think of 2 books about Nauvoo in the last 2 years, but we haven't had many on the winter quarters. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that kind of difference and reasons why.
My book is so good that nobody dares write another one. That's why.
Yeah, perfect. Exactly.
I got a copy of it right here. No, I think the feeling has been that Iowa was just jump over and get on to the important things. And I wrote this book initially as my dissertation at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. And my mentor there, a marvelous man named Phil Mason, had found the 1857 and 1858 Brigham Young journals. And he wasn't a Mormon by any stretch, but a wonderful, wonderful mentor. And he said, Dick, why don't you write on the Mormon Exodus? And why not? And he said, take it all the way back to Nauvoo. He says, tell more about what happened in Iowa. Tell more about all the story further east than west, because it's a great story. And then James Allen, who was the assistant church historian for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, suggested that I write on winter quarters in Iowa because, frankly, you're right, very little had been done on it. And with the church becoming more open with its records than ever before, for instance, we now publish the Joseph Smith papers, everything that's possible, practically published. It's been a more open season to be able to research into the journals and the minutes and the diaries and the letters. It's just been begging. That story is just been overlooked. We don't usually talk about how we got there, just getting there.
Yeah.
To me, the story is the journey, not the destination.
Yeah, and it's such a compelling story at that too. Of the struggle and the challenge and the growth and the development, and you really it's deeply human. In the way that you kind of taught, write about it, right? You really get the sense of how hard it was, but also how dedicated everyone was, and also this kind of sense of trying to figure it out as we go along. As far as destinations, it's just. I think it's really compelling, but I'm probably a biased observer too, right? I love Iowa history, and I just think
it's also a chapter in the biography of Brigham Young. Joseph Smith was killed, as I said, in Carthage, Illinois, in June of 1844. Brigham Young will not become his successor, bona fide, recognized successor, until 3.5 years later. And so this period of crossing Iowa is when there's an absence of a president of the church. There's plenty of discussion as who should be Joseph Smith's successor. There's not just rain that's falling, there's cross currents and different claims who should be the leader. And so you have this all going on when there's this governmental impasse. There's this who's in charge of the church. And so you have a lot of tension, I guess is the right word, but a lot of discussion over where is this church going to go? Who should be the leader? What are we going to follow and how are we going to do it? And so it isn't just the trail, it's the trial of leadership. It's the trial of discipleship. The church came close to being blown to the seven winds at that time because of all the difficulties of crossing Iowa and getting established. It was a critical moment. That's another reason why I wrote on it, because of all these other cross currents. Thematic cross currents that transcend more than just the weather of Iowa. It's the leadership, it's the discipleship, it's the contrary claims. For instance, George Miller, who was the associate presiding bishop and who will break with the church at winter quarters, he says, Brother Brigham, they always call him Brother Brigham, by the way. You're going in the wrong direction. We should be going up the Vermilion or the Niobrara up to the Tongue River, Yellowstone country. Brigham Young says, no, we should be going in the Platte River country across. And so he breaks with the church and breaks with Brigham Young. And you see that sometimes happening. And so there's a lot of, like you said, human nature in the wild, in the raw. It's Mormonism in the raw. It's a time of great consternation. The development of leadership in Brigham Young, no matter what you think of Brigham Young, was remarkable. To lead that many people that successfully took tremendous leadership skills.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, right? Of this person who is able to kind of lead and step into this, and even like you mentioned, the cross currents and the challenges. Hearing about the other groups of Latter-day Saints or that are emerging with other leaders, trying to send missionaries and bring people and draw people away. It really was this dynamic and uncertain time that he steps into and leads people all the way out to eventually the Great Basin.
Yes, especially with that great disappointment of the loss of Joseph Smith, who was their original founding leader. His death was a tremendous blow. It was a shattering blow to the church. It took Brigham Young and the whole Iowa experience and further west to galvanize the membership to follow a new leader. It's a moment that is just full of exciting details and stories and drama.
Wonderful. Well, and with that, we have some questions coming in from the audience. And if you're in the audience, go ahead and drop any other questions. We've got plenty of time into the Q&A. And I'm just going to read a few of these and we'll kind of discuss what's on the folks who've read the book's mind. The first question, it says, how much did the struggle to cross Iowa play a part in some efforts play a part in deciding to stay and settle in Iowa. There were certainly areas of Iowa to be away from the government influence. So what part did the struggle play in deciding to move on from Iowa, and maybe with the disillusionment that Brigham Young was feeling toward some of the challenges? Does that make some sense?
Well, let me think. I'll try to answer what I think the question is.
Yeah.
It was the crossing of Iowa in that wet spring of 46 that held them back. And so by the time they didn't get to the Missouri River until the 14th of June. The vanguard companies, every mountain trader and trapper said that unless you're away by the 1st of June, you'll never make it to the Rockies. And that's just the vanguard companies that are there. And the other 1,800 wagons are chugging along behind them and slogging their way. And so they had to stay in Iowa or Council Bluffs. And some of them on the Nebraska side, 4,400 in winter quarters, 4,000 Council Bluffs, another 4,000 up and down the Missouri River Valley on the Iowa side. So by the time they got there, they had no choice but for the majority to stay in Iowa. Some of the enemies of the church, the critics of the church, said, "You're going to die in the wilderness," and you all know it. And they said Iowa's going to be too difficult to get across, in which they were right, but still most will follow Brigham Young.
Mm-hmm. And was that kind of crucible or I guess the question too, that I'm hearing in this question was there ever serious consideration of staying in Iowa or moving to a part of Iowa where there was even less government reach? Northwest Iowa wasn't settled for even decades later, or was it always going to be the Rockies?
The answer is no, because they were leaving Babylon, quote, quote, to Zion, quote, quote, in the wilderness. They're leaving America. Iowa is part of America. It's a territory. It's going to become a state. Everybody knew it was going to become a state in December of 46, or at least the Saints knew that. So Iowa wasn't in their mindset to stay. But because they had to stay, they stayed there for a few years to prepare to go west. Iowa was the launching point for that. But no serious discussion as a church as a whole. But some who stayed back loved Iowa enough to stay there, and they weren't going to follow the Saints west, and they became part of this Western Iowa story. But for the church as a whole, not to stay there, not to stay in Nebraska or Wyoming or Illinois. It's to get right out of there to the Rocky Mountains. And
this is probably a different conversation than about the book, but it strikes me as interesting too that there was this desire to leave the United States, but after the Mexican-American War, where they're going ends up being a part of the United States.
And that's an irony. In the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty of 1848, much of the Western becomes part of the United States, but they'll buy time.
Yeah.
And that wasn't just time, it was distance. They wanted to be fully removed from their enemies back east and going to the Rockies. Even if it did become part of the United States at that time, it's going to give them at least a generation or two away from their enemies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that answers the question. If it didn't, to the person who asked, feel free to write in another, and we've got time to talk about it some more. The next question we've got here is: where was Miller's Ponca settlement approximately located?
George Miller, who breaks with Brigham Young at winter quarters in January of 47, he had gone ahead to Grand Island at first, because he thought that maybe we should be having at least a winter settlement at Grand Island. That didn't work out so well, so Brigham Young asked him to come back, but he and Brigham Young don't get along. There's not room enough for both men in the whole American West. They were very, very much at each other's odds with one another. So George Miller accepts an invitation from the Ponca Indians to go north from the Grand Island region all the way up to Niobrara, which is near the Vermilion River, as you know. And it's there where about 200 Saints will spend the winter of 46 and 47 as a satellite community to winter quarters down there, near today's Omaha. And so that was the winter of 46 and 47 where that Niobrara settlement continues, but because of a prairie fire that destroyed most of their cabins, and because most people wanted to come back where the headquarters of the church was, at winter quarters, Niobrara only lasted the winter of 46 and 47. Miller breaks with Brigham Young at winter quarters and will go and join Lyman White's group in Texas, and eventually goes north to join Jimmy Strang's group in Beaver Island, and eventually breaks with him. And we think he died somewhere in Illinois, and we're still looking for him.
Very interesting. This, especially hearing about his journey after, of breaking multiple times with multiple leaders, and eventually ending up kind of not being able to find him, away from any sort
It's
of.
really a sad story about George Miller and his tag along. His name was James Emmett. And, they have their agency. They can do with it as they wish. But he kept looking for the successor of Joseph. He couldn't accept Brigham Young, looked for it in others. He dies of a broken heart. Really. It's a sad story.
There's so much dedication and fervent. There's just a fervent commitment. You see a lot in the book, as you're reading of the men and women who are engaged in this exodus, as you said, and even someone like Miller, I think it's helpful to think through as kind of having that zeal, albeit not expressed in the way that the majority did, right? He was still very fervent.
But Miller, since you mentioned him, he was a great scout. He knew Iowa. He had crossed Iowa before the main vanguard companies did. He was a great guide. And I got to give credit to Miller, even though he breaks with Brigham Young. He was the one who was able to show the best possible ways across Iowa, because he knew Iowa very, very well. And so we got to give credit to him, as many did. But it's a fact that he does break with the church, and ends up looking for something he can never find again.
Yeah, incredible story. Just sad, but also revealing, right? Some of these important figures in the history of the church their story doesn't end with the church. Another question we've got here is, you mentioned in your book that there was quite a bit of trading and labor to earn money in northern Missouri. And the question is, what was the reception different in Missouri that you just discussed about the support provided by the people of Iowa? So was there a difference between how people were being received in northern Missouri versus what they were received in Iowa? Or was there, and I'd add to that question just because I'm curious, was there a difference in that part of northern Missouri and maybe what was experienced in the other parts of Missouri where there'd been some conflict?
Now, that's an excellent question. And I'm going to answer it in a way that most Mormons wouldn't even understand. The fact is, Missouri becomes the lifeline of the Mormon exodus. And that's a paradox, because Missouri had driven out the Saints in 1838 and 1839. And there was even a bounty on their heads. Governor Boggs had passed an extermination order that to exterminate the Mormons and just drive them from the state. And that was the genesis for the Nauvoo, Illinois community in the first place, was to go back to Illinois to settle. But now in 46, as the Saints are leaving across Iowa, eastern Iowa, very friendly, giving provisions and helping. We've already established that. But as they move from the Des Moines River Valley west, in what is today the Corydon, Creston area, the Chariton River, the Grand River country of southern Iowa, there's no farms out there, Andrew. There's no Iowans. And so they have to go down to Missouri to get provisions, because they're running out of provisions. They can't feed themselves all. And so they're going down to Missouri. And why are they going to Missouri? Because Missouri had come into this union 26 years before, comes a state in 1820, long before Iowa does. And so you have many more farms along the northern tier of counties in Missouri that are welcoming, if not inviting the saints to come down. Some of them, not all Missourians were hateful of the saints by any stretch. They were very open-minded and helpful. They literally saved the Latter-day Saint exodus in many ways. Iowans helped in the East, but by the time they got Midwest and West, there aren't any Iowans. And so we had to go down to Missouri. And Missouri, as I said, became eventually the lifeline, because they also go down during the winter of 46 and 47 to St. Louis and St. Joseph and other places in Missouri and take jobs. I mean, you know, they had to work for it, help split fences and rails and everything else. And so Missouri, that's why they're going down there. And they weren't any less well received than they were in Iowa. They just had to go there.
It's I think a useful way to think about, you know, to remind ourselves that that no one was in those parts of Iowa. But also I really appreciate your point about how, you know, Missouri had driven the saints out, and then it was also this place where they needed to return to in order to find those provisions. But also that apparently the people of Missouri were willing to help. Was there any
sometimes they went incognito.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
They were fearful for their lives. There were a lot of Missourians who despised the Mormons, but many Missourians said, "What's the problem with them? These people are good people. We can help them out. They can work for us." I mean, let's not chase the cat out of the kitchen too fast. I mean, it'll be a blessing to us. It'll be a blessing to them.
Yeah.
Let's talk turkey, and they did, and it was a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I really thought that part of the book was also helpful in kind of reminding us of the dynamics and also this kind of relationship with Missouri. I appreciated that. Another question that's come in is, this individual says, I'm fascinated with the Mormons who stayed in Iowa. The Charles Thompson settlement of Preparation Canyon is quite the story. I'm not familiar with it, but they ask if you're familiar with the Preparation Canyon story and Charles Thompson.
Just a little bit. He broke with the church and started his own organization that in Western Iowa, not too far from here. He wasn't the only one. You've got other groups like Gladden Bishop is going to start a group. There are little breakoffs of the church that start here in Iowa and in Nebraska. But I want to say one thing. It's not well known that some Mormons who went west came back. Not just those who went west and some who stayed here, but some went west, and especially after the announcement on plural marriage in 1852, which really rocked the boat. And some said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stay. And they came back. And one of the most famous is Gutzon Borglum. His family, his mother, his father. His father comes back. He was born into a polygamous family. And you know that Borglum goes on to be the great sculptor of Mount Rushmore. And so you get some of these, what we call staybacks, some comebacks, and then like the Thompson group and the Gladden Bishop group, some breakoffs. And so you got a lot of things swirling around here. It's not all, but it's an east-west movement. It's not just all west. It's, you know what I mean? And it's circular.
Yeah,
so,
that's such an important part of any sort of migration history, with, you know, in this case with the Saints, but other times other groups too, is that many people who settle somewhere, others come back, and there's this constant flow of people in both directions. And so often in our histories, we say, well, they started here and they moved this way and they landed here, and that was the story. But you're exactly right. There's people who stay behind and people who break away and people who come back, and that makes a much more complicated, but I think a more interesting and exciting story in a lot of cases.
Yes. And I should mention that the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was headquartered in Lamoni, Iowa, for the longest time, well known in central Iowa, their fundamental break with the church was over polygamy. And so they stay in Iowa and have made a tremendous contribution in Iowa and in Missouri. They're headquartered today in Independence, Jackson County, Missouri. That is the largest group that has, you might call them that group that stayed and developed and became a major influence for good here in this area. far bigger than the Thompsonians, the Gladenites, or anything else, was the tremendous contribution of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now called the Community of Christ, of which many, many members of that church are scattered all over, especially Western Iowa.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a university, Graceland University down in Lamona, that contributes a lot as well. And then Hy-Vee, as you mentioned earlier, right, has its roots.
No question about it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I've got another question here. We still have some time, so if those in the audience want to ask any other questions, make sure to get those in here in the next few minutes. But the next question I've got for you is, and it's maybe more of a clarification question. It says, why did the Mormons get such a bad reputation if they were abolitionists and anti-racist for the time? So the question is, what would have been so objectionable about being, abolitionists or anti-racist, kind of in that earlier period, probably especially in Missouri, maybe in Illinois?
Well, that's a powerful question, and it's going to take a few minutes to answer it, but I'll try to be brief. The heritage of the saints in Missouri, yes, it was a different religion, and there was persecution over religion, but the Latter-day Saints were Yankees, mainly from Vermont and New York, Pennsylvania, and other places in the Northeast, and they did not like slavery. And here comes the saints who did not like slavery into Jackson County. Was a little Dixie. Jackson County was settled by Carolinians and Virginians and those who had their slaves with them. And there's going to be great consternation amongst the saints with their fellow Missourians. And so this is going to be one of the major reasons for the expulsion of the saints from Missouri, because we weren't abolitionists, but we were opposed to slavery. And to be opposed to slavery in antebellum Missouri was dynamite. Not only that, we thought that the gospel of Jesus Christ is found in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is written to the American Indian, to the Lamanites. And here we are proselyting amongst the Indians, and that didn't go over very well when America was trying to get rid of them, just push them out. Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. Here we are, along with some other Christian faiths, trying to teach the Indians. That was dynamite. And so then you get to Nauvoo, you got a whole new religion there. Ben Park talks about that in one of his books. He takes a look at the politics particularly, but I look more fundamentally at the doctrines. We weren't teaching regular doctrines, if you will. We weren't Trinitarian. In another book of scripture, we're also perceived as being anti-American. Joseph Smith running for president. And he only did it, by the way, to bring attention to our plight in Missouri. But that was perceived as being anti-American, too much church and state. We were seen as anti-family. The whole idea of perhaps some teaching plural marriage, that was a dynamite situation. So you add them all up and you got a combustible, as we said earlier, of persecution.
Yeah, that's really helpful, especially for this question, to remember that places like Missouri allowed slavery, and that there were these kind of tensions.
Missouri was a leading slave state. It came in as a union on the basis that they'd be allowed to have slaves.
And even in parts of Iowa, Iowa was a free state, but there was a lot of different opinions, that weren't always agreed upon, and that would change in the next few decades. But there was still there was a very different political climate when it came to dealing with enslaved people and Native Americans, especially. That's helpful. I think it's a helpful answer, and a great question. So, all right, we've got another question here. It's just kind of, when the book was written and to now, are there stories or what kinds of things have you learned or stories have you found that are interesting to you about this today? I imagine you've kept digging into these things, and are there new stories or new elements or angles that I think this question is asking that you'd like to? Well,
I published 2 books since then that really keep focus on the Mormon Exodus. One is We'll Find the Place, published by Deseret Book, which takes it from Council Bluffs to the Great Salt Lake and back. And then just 2 years ago, I published the diaries, edited and published the diaries of a man named Horace K. Whitney,
Mm-hmm.
who was with the early vanguard Mormons. And then his wife went years later and published reflective commentary on her husband's diary. And I published them together, especially across Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get these human interest stories that from the husband and the wife reflectively. And I saw some things, especially about the sacrifice of the women, that I didn't see before.
Mm-hmm.
All the challenges of keeping a home in a wagon.
Mm-hmm.
This one woman, Helen Mar Kimball Whitney, she says when she gets in her wagon, it was like paradise. I could put my spinning wheel in there, and I could put my library in there, and I could have my table. She says it was the greatest thing that she'd ever seen because she'd been walking before.
Yeah.
And so the women's perspective is something that I've gained a greater interest in as the years have gone by, because it's not just a focus on Brigham Young, it's the regular person, the men and the women and the boys and the girls.
Yeah.
This is families, remember. What was it like to have that many families, normal people, and what were they facing? That's the part that I find most interesting now.
Yeah, and one thing I really appreciate about the larger Mormon history is how well documented so much is, that you can find these diaries and stories and things that are written down. Not always a lot of them, but there's so much in the historical record that we can explore, which is not always the case, but is very exciting in my experience. There's so much to learn. And
well, the reason for that is that many of the descendants of the pioneers who have remained in Utah or as Mormons have contributed those diaries, and still are, to not just to the Church Historical Library, but to other libraries here in Nebraska, even in Iowa, so that the story continues to unfold because more sources keep coming to light. And I don't think we're ever going to get to the end of this trail. It just keeps going on and on.
And it's wonderful, and it's so great to get those kind of, like you said, those everyday people's experiences. Not just the leaders, but what was it like for this woman who was so excited to have a wagon. But it's so important for us to capture that element of the story as well, because it gives us that sense of what it was really like for those people who walked and rode thousands of miles.
Well, one lady, she writes about Garden Grove, which is in the center of the state, as you know, just west of Corydon. And they had to put in a way station or a farm, and she talks about the rattlesnakes.
Yeah.
And the place was infested with them, and she had to put up her tents in the midst of this. And she talks about it from a female perspective that is, wow, this is amazing. And it's just really insightful to see the different attitudes. And now these are civilized people. These are people, many of whom are from England, who had never been driving an ox before, an ox wagon. And here they are in Iowa trying to slog their way through. And it's that story of human interest that no matter what religion you are, it's just, that's you and me out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that real sense, I think, of people who have come from a very different way of life, finding themselves out on the prairie is particularly interesting, right? These are not fur traders or people who have lived their lives out in the wilderness necessarily. These are people who have come from a very different environment, and their faith and their dedication has driven them into a very different context, which creates...
This one gentleman from England, he calls it the science of oxology. He says, I never knew how to drive ox in my life. And now here they are learning how to drive a wagon with oxen in the mud of Iowa. Iowa is a learning curve for all these people. It's a real learning curve of survival.
Yeah, it's incredible. We're right at our time, but I'm going to ask you one more question as the chair's prerogative. And that's just, what are the best ways, if people have listened tonight, they've read the book, they're going to read the book, what are the best ways to visit some of these historic sites today? How can people learn more? That's one thing I love about this book, is that we can still go see so much of it. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about as we're wrapping up, how to find these sites and how we can learn more.
Well, for Iowa especially, you would start at Nauvoo, Illinois. Across the river is Montrose, tiny little Montrose, and you can see Iowa in the background, and you can almost picture yourself heading west with the Saints. And it's Nauvoo is receding, Iowa is beginning. So there, and then go to Richardson's Point, which is near Milton, Iowa, on J40, that little highway there, not far from Milton, and that's going to be one of the main way stations. And then you're going to find another Corydon, the wonderful museum in Corydon has a Mormon section to it. Wonderful place to visit. Mount Pisgah, which is not even a community. It's just off of Highway 169 and 34 out there in Western Iowa. There's a big section for the Mormon cemetery there. And then, of course, over here in Council Bluffs, even though the old tabernacle was just raised because it was falling apart, we have a beautiful visitor center there in Council Bluffs. It tells much of the story. And then, of course, here where I'm at now in Omaha, North Omaha, the Mormon Trail Center, which is the largest center to celebrate the Mormon Trail. It has artifacts. We give tours every day. We have hundreds of people coming here because the Mormon Trail is more popular than the California and the Oregon Trail combined in terms of people coming to visit. So these would be great. Short of going to Salt Lake itself, these are the places I would recommend, Andrew, that it be for people to come.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think, as people who are in Iowa, especially if you're in the southern part of the state, a lot of these different places might not be too far, even if you can't make it all the way across one side or the other. I think I really appreciate that and hope people can take that with them. But we're also at our time at 8:02, and I think we've answered lots of questions, and I've had a great time. I love talking about this history with you, whether that's here at book club or when we've been together a few other times. It's always really a privilege, and I just am so grateful that you've joined us here tonight. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I think for everyone else.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the invitation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. You've been a great host, and we welcome everyone to come and visit us.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. We appreciate it. We want to thank everyone who was here today. If you want to sign up for our next book club, we are going to be focusing on one of Iowa's most prominent politicians, Henry A. Wallace. And we'll be joined by Tim Walsh, who is the Director Emeritus of the Herbert Hoover Library. And we'll be discussing John Culver and John Hyde's biography of Wallace, American Dreamer. So we'll be going from the 1840s to really the 1940s to talk about the life of Henry Wallace. But another great story that'll be in September. So we're taking a break for the summer and we'll be back off in September. But with that, I think that is everything that we have. You can always check out more of our programming, the Iowa 101 series or the Goldie's Kids Clubs, or any of the other activities taking place in Des Moines or Iowa City at our website, iowaculture.gov. And with that, I just want to say thank you once again to Dr. Bennett. It's been my absolute pleasure, and wish everyone a wonderful night. Thanks so much and have a great evening.